Hello, everyone. This is Ann Cuppinger with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the second webinar in a series that we're doing on kinship care. And today's topic is financial assistance for kinship caregivers. And we're really delighted today to be joined by folks from the Kinship Navigator, Ray Glazer, who's the co-director, and Ryan Johnson, who's the associate director. And they're going to be sharing their knowledge about this topic today. A few basics about how the webinar functions before we get into the content. So if you haven't done so already, we would encourage you to call into the webinar using the conference number using your phone. When you join the webinar, you're going to be placed on mute to avoid background noise, but we really would like to hear your questions. So there is a chat function in the webinar, and if you click on the speech bubble icon on the bottom of the screen, it will open up the chat box to the right. And there you'll be able to type in any questions that you have, and we encourage you to do that throughout the webinar rather than waiting until the end, because that gives our presenters a chance to have a sense of what your questions are as they go through the content. What we'd like you to do when you chat your questions is to use that drop-down menu and chat your question to the host. Our host today is Connor, and she's in the background collecting all of your questions. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, you can also chat to the host to get assistance. So within about a week, we'll post the recording of this webinar and the slides on the CTEC website. You can find that if you navigate on our website to the upcoming events tab, which will bring up a calendar, and you go to today's date, and you'll find the slides and the recording posted there, again, within a few days. So I'd like to take a minute to introduce our presenters today. First of all, we have Ray Glazer, and Ray's been working with Kinship Navigator since its inception in 2006, when she started as the first kinship specialist. Since then, she has worked with thousands of caregivers over the phone and via email. In 2017, she became the co-director and oversees daily operations of the project. She manages the helpline, the budget, the database, the website, and liaisons with local kinship program providers across the state. She also acts as the administrator for 5 of the local program's peer-led support groups, and she acts as the regional navigator for the Western and Central region. Ryan Johnson is the associate director of the New York State Kinship Navigator. Ryan started his career in child welfare by working in the waiver programs, both the OMH and the Bridges to Health waiver programs. And then he started working with kinship care in 2015 through the Center for Human Services Research, where he was the project coordinator for the Kinship Navigator demonstration project. And he was subsequently hired by the Navigator after that project ended as the policy coordinator with the KinCare Coalition. And in that role, he worked to expand the use of kinship caregivers. Ryan leads the Navigator's outreach and virtual case assistance program, a pilot project funded by the Children's Bureau aimed at giving caregivers more personalized, intensive case assistance. So as you can see, we have folks here who have a lot of experience all across New York State and nationally with kinship care, and we're just delighted that they're able to join us today to do this presentation. Just a little future announcement. There will be a third webinar looking at legal options for kinship caregivers. So if some of your questions tend toward the legal topic, we might ask you to come back and get your answers on March 3rd. And at the end of this slide deck, you'll also see a link to the first webinar, which was sort of an overview of kinship care in New York State. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ray.
Thanks, Ann. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to give a little bit of an overview of what kinship care looks like, kinship care services in New York, in case you weren't able to join us for the first webinar. And then we really want to spend some time talking about support services and benefits for caregivers. We're going to talk about TANF benefits and public assistance, Social Security disability, Social Security death benefits, foster care payments, adoption subsidies, and kin gap payments. And this is just to note that we intend to have future kinship webinars on kinship law, as Ann notated, and also on trauma and loss for caregivers. So what is kinship care? Kinship care refers to non-parent relatives and fictive kin who are grandparents, other relatives, and family friends that are caring for children full-time in their homes in the absence of the biological parents. Usually we're seeing kinship caregivers that are grandparents, but we also see aunts, uncles, cousins, adult siblings, and as I said earlier, fictive kin, which is usually a family friend or a neighbor or somebody that has a strong attachment to the child. There's about 195,000 kids in kinship care right now in New York. And if we're taking a look at the demographics, 1 in 11 of all children will live in a kinship home during their childhood. 1 in 5 Black children will live in a kinship home. And we see about half of these children are under the age of 6. 50% of the caregivers that are taking these children on full-time have children in their home that are 5 years of age or younger. And as we noted in our first webinar, kids come into kinship care for a lot of the same reasons that they would come into foster care. It's abuse, neglect, parental substance abuse, incarceration, mental health issues. They're usually not coming into the home for a good reason. So we see a lot of kinship care children that have seen trauma. They're often upset and derailed. They have high ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences. And there's a lot of mixed emotions, a lot of issues as they come into home. And what we find is that kids that are placed with kinship care often have much better outcomes. They tend to have more permanent and stable outcomes in the home when they're placed with kin as opposed to stranger foster care. Profiles of kinship caregivers, as I said earlier, about 65% of caregivers are grandparents. There are other family members, of course, but what we normally see is maternal grandma who's stepping in to care for her grandchild when the mom cannot parent. The average age of a caregiver is 56 years old, so we see a lot of caregivers that are in the sandwich generation where they're caring for both a kinship child and they might be caring for an elderly parent. They're usually employed full-time, so they have to think about things like child care when they're taking on a kinship care child. And 36% of households have an income of less than $20,000 a year. So we see a lot of these families that are living in poverty that are trying to take these kids on and care for them full-time. Broken down by race, about half of caregivers are Caucasian, and then a quarter are African American, and a quarter are Hispanic. When we're looking at custodial arrangements for children, it's important to note that there are many different options for caregivers, and as we talk about financial benefits, some of these are important for us to note in the very beginning of this webinar. We see families that are in informal care where they have no court order. They've not been to family court for any reason. They might have a parental designation form that gives us some information to give the caregiver some decision-making authority on behalf of the child. They may have gone to family court and gotten custody, whether it's joint with the parent, temporary custody, or sole custody. They might have legal guardianship. They might have gone into foster care or transitioned from foster care into kin gap or kinship guardianship, or they may have adopted the children. As we go through each of the financial options, some of these are very relevant to the different custodial arrangements that kids have, kinship caregivers have. But just to note that there is a webinar coming up on March 3rd to hear more about these custodial options for caregivers, as the law is quite in-depth. As we're supporting families that are kinship caregivers, it's important to note that kinship caregivers might receive children in a multitude of ways. They might become kinship foster parents. Very few caregivers are foster parents in upstate New York, but about 25% of New York City foster care is children living with relatives or kin. There might be CPS facilitated placement where the caregiver has the children placed with them, but then they opt to not become a kinship foster parent and they go for NDAC custody, or they're placed in a safety plan. And Ryan's going to talk a little bit more about that. Or they might be placed in private care where there's no CPS involvement whatsoever. And then we're looking at something where it's a custodial agreement, or the caregiver's gotten legal guardianship, or they don't have any formal placement whatsoever. So the caregiving arrangement really does determine the amount of support that a family is eligible for, whether they're going for TANF support or it's from child welfare, foster care, or others community supports. And all of the information on kinship care in New York State is available on our Kinship Navigator website under our policy section, and we're happy to distribute that to anybody that's looking for it. So as we're talking about kinship families, just important to note that there are services for families. There are support services across the state. The program that Ryan and I are both part of is the Kinship Navigator, and we want to make sure that we can connect families to financial assistance. We can give them all the information on their legal options and provide legal advocacy. We partner with all the local kinship services across the state, as well as the Departments of Social Services. And we have a centralized database where we can do an intake on caregivers and then provide them the information that's tailored to what they are looking for, as well as referrals in the community. Our helpline is right at the bottom of the slide, and our website, and we are there for caregivers Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. So after all of that background information, let's get to the heart of what we're looking at today, which are benefits for kinship caregivers. I'm going to be talking about benefits for informal caregivers, which is benefits for caregivers that are outside of the foster care system. So we're looking at caregivers that have no formal legal designation. We're looking at legal custodians, legal guardians. And the main form of financial assistance for kinship caregivers that are informal is through public assistance. There is a grant in New York State that's called the Non-Parent Grant. Its real name is the Non-Parent Grant, but it's also called several other names. It may be called the Child Only Grant, the NPG Grant, the PACO Grant. It seems as if every county in New York State calls it something different, but the term of art is the Non-Parent Grant. And what that is it's a monthly cash grant that's available to kinship caregivers by the Department of Social Services. In New York State, unless you are the biological parent or the adoptive parent of a child, you are not considered to be financially responsible for the child in your care. So when you apply for the non-parent grant, you are applying for temporary assistance on behalf of the child. It's intended for you to help meet the needs of the kinship children in your care. So when you apply for it, you are in essence charging rent and shelter and living expenses for the children in your care. Now, no kinship caregiver would really charge rent to a kinship child, but that is the way that the state looks at the grant. And in essence, the caregiver acts as the payee while the temporary assistance grant comes in the child's name. Kinship children that are eligible for this grant are also eligible for Medicaid. So who is eligible for this grant? As I said earlier, anybody that's caring for a child that is not the biological or adoptive parent. The grant is based on the child's income and not the caregiver's income. When we talk to caregivers, we like to tell them that Bill Gates could apply for this grant for his niece if he was caring for her, as long as his niece did not have any income coming in her name. Income coming in the child's name could be Social Security death benefits, could be Social Security, supplemental security income, disability. It could be child support for the parents, but very few caregivers that are caring for children have income coming in the child's name. So most caregivers are eligible for this grant that are in informal care. Children are eligible until they turn 19 years old while they're enrolled in school, which is not post-secondary. If they're still enrolled in high school and they are 18 years old, they're still eligible for the grant. and caregivers do not need court-ordered custody or guardianship. They can have a parental designation form. They can have no designation form whatsoever. All they need to do is prove that the child is living with them full-time. The amount of the grant varies from county to county. It's roughly $430 a month for the first child and $150 a month for each additional child. And at the bottom of the slide, there is a link to the Empire Justice website that shows you county by county what the breakdown is. We encourage you, as always, to have caregivers connect with us so that we can walk them through it based on their county. But you'll generally see that downstate and Long Island have higher amounts of the grant simply because the cost of living is higher downstate. So the process for public assistance is that the caregiver fills out the Department of Social Services Form 2921 and brings to the local Department of Social Services. They have an initial interview within the first 7 days, and then the grant is processed within 30 days if you're a family member, and within 45 days if you are not a family member, if you are a fictive kin or, in essence, a family friend. And that's simply because the money comes from a different pot. What we do with the navigator is we assist caregivers filling out that application if they need it. That 27-page form application that the Department of Social Services has is not the easiest thing in the world to fill out. And when you're filling it out as a kinship caregiver, you are filling it out as the payee. So there are different sections that you have to fill out based on the child, and then there's different sections that you have to fill out based on yourself as the payee. So we have an online guide on our website that shows you page by page how to fill out that application. It'll tell you how to fill out every line of it. And then we also have an online video that shows you that application and shows somebody filling that application out via video so that you understand how to fill it out page by page. We are also able to fill out the application with caregivers via phone. And in the virtual assistance counties that Ryan is covering right now as part of our federal grant, we're able to assist caregivers as well, filling out that application. Like as I said, it's not the easiest thing in the world to fill out, so we want to make sure that caregivers are going to DSS prepared and that they're not rejected at the initial interview for filling out the application incorrectly. As part of that public assistance grant, the Department of Social Services is going to ask you to comply with child support cooperation. As I said earlier, the caregiver, since they're not the biological or adoptive parent, is not financially responsible for the child, which means the Department of Social Services is going to turn around and try to collect the money from the parents who are financially responsible for the children. So they will ask the caregiver to assist with complying with that child support. If the caregiver refuses to comply, there are two paths. There is something called the good cause exemption, whether if the caregiver feels that there will be physical or emotional harm to them or the child in their care, they can refuse to comply with child support. Usually see that when there's domestic violence in the biological parent's home. So if the caregiver's got a fear that if the Department of Social Services goes for child support that there might be retaliation from the parents or physical harm, they can just refuse to comply with that with no adverse repercussions to receiving the grant. If they refuse to comply and there's not deemed that there's a good reason, they will receive a 25% sanction. In our first webinar, we had a conversation about how there's emotional considerations when we're talking about these kinship caregivers. And sometimes you see caregivers that don't want to rock the boat with the family. Usually when it's maternal grandma and she doesn't want to hurt her biological child and go after her for child support, she can just refuse to comply with child support and they will impose a 25% sanction on the grant. So instead of getting $430, she may get $300 for the grant. We do have ADMs, Administrative Directive Memorandums, on our website for all of these. And if there's a caregiver that's experiencing any problems with the Department of Social Services, we're happy to guide them to make sure that they're able to get this grant. Exceptions to the grant, there are always exceptions when it comes to anything. The main ones that we see are when the parent is in the home. If the parent is under the age of 18, so if you're looking at grandma who's got a child that is 17 and she gives birth to a child, then the grant would not be available to that grandparent because she is the biological parent of the minor that gave birth to the child. So she is responsible for both the parent and the kinship child since they are both underaged. If the parent is disabled but is residing in the home, often the caregiver is able to receive the grant because they are the one making decisions for the child. So if there's a kinship caregiver in the home and then there's a biological parent, but the biological parent is disabled and making no decisions for the child, then that kinship caregiver should be entitled to receive the grant. For any of those circumstances, we recommend that the caregiver get in touch with us as well. When the caregiver is on temporary assistance themselves, the amount of the grant is much less because what the Department of Social Services will do is they will add that child to the caregiver's household income and put them on the same grant. That is a piece of legislation that we've been fighting at the Navigator for years because it's really an unfair practice to families that are disadvantaged to begin with. If there's siblings in the home, there are at times when the amount of money received by the sibling is deemed available to the kinship caregiver. If there is one sibling in the home that is receiving Social Security death benefits for a parent, and then they have a half sibling that is trying to apply for the grant but is receiving no assistance whatsoever, the income of that first sibling is deemed available to the second sibling. If there is a sibling in the home that is a kinship caregiver's biological child, then the entire household income is deemed available because the kinship caregiver is responsible for the biological child, and then that child's income is deemed available to the second child. And then when there are siblings in the home that are age 20 and 21, they normally would not be eligible for the grant, but if there is a younger child in the home, then they are eligible for the grant as an essential person until they turn 21. I hope that everybody is still awake at this point, but this is just to note that there are a lot of exceptions to the grant. So if you're in doubt at all, please have the caregiver call us. And we've had experiences, and I know that anybody that's working with caregivers in the webinar right now, is that sometimes the Department of Social Services might enforce something that is not part of their policy and practice. So we do get a lot of caregivers that call us that are refusing to comply with child support, that are told by the Department of Social Services that they're just not eligible for the grant. And as I said earlier, we do have ADMs on our website that we can assist with caregivers. So if there's something that doesn't sound right and the caregivers are told to withdraw their application, or they're being rude to the caregivers that are applying and telling them things that are not true, get them in touch with us. We'll make sure that at least the caregivers have the tools that they need for advocacy on the local Department of Social Services level. We also have contacted the Navigator for OTDA, temporary disability assistance, where if there's something that's not sounding right about when a caregiver is applying for the grant, we can assist that caregiver with our connection. So get them in touch with us if you have any questions at all. Other forms of financial assistance with the Public Assistance Grant are Medicaid, summer camp, child care. If a caregiver applies, as I said, the child is eligible for the grant, they're eligible for Medicaid. Department of Social Services can also provide up to $400 a year in summer camp fees. The way that they do this varies from county to county, so check with us first. And then based on the caregiver's income and work schedule, they may be eligible for child care. That is definitely county to county based. It's funding eligible and it's caregiver income eligible. The same thing with SNAP or HEAP. A lot of caregivers ask us about SNAP benefits. SNAP is based on the entire household income, not just the child's. Same thing with HEAP. So the two other forms of financial assistance I've alluded to very briefly for informal caregivers are supplemental security income, which is SSI. That is benefits for children with disabilities. So usually what we will see, if there's a caregiver that's raising a child with a disability, they're probably already receiving SSI, and usually it is more than the amount of the non-parent grant. So a child cannot receive both unless their SSI income is less than $400 a month. If they're receiving $200 a month in SSI, they would be eligible to receive up to that $430 whole for the public assistance grant. So they receive about $230 a month for the public assistance grant. But this is considered income for the child. It's benefits for children that have disabilities. You can apply at your local Social Security offices. And in order to apply, you need to be a guardian, custodian, or those demonstrating concern for a beneficiary's well-being, which is very, very broad. We've noticed at the Navigator that initial application is often denied, and it's simply just because it's a little bit of a process. So we've got guides on our website as to how to apply for SSI and what to do if you are initially denied that income. As I said, the amount of the income is often higher than the non-parent grant, and it's very important to note that if you have two kinship children in your home, one is receiving SSI and one is not receiving anything, that second child would be eligible for the non-parent grant. And that is because SSI income is invisible income. So the one child that's receiving that SSI income, their income would not be deemed available to the second child. The other form of income that we see with families are Social Security survivor benefits, and that is when their natural children may receive these benefits when their natural or adoptive parents are deceased. The benefit amount is based on the parent's work history and earned income, so this is kind of all over the place. A child may be receiving quite a bit in Social Security survivor benefits, or they may be receiving very little. And again, the same rules apply. If they're receiving less than $400, they can go ahead and apply for that non-parent grant, and the calculation will be roughly the same as it would be for SSI. Now, the big difference for this one is the income is deemed available. So if one child in the household is receiving Social Security survivor benefits, then that income is available to other children in the home. So if one child's receiving $1,000 a month in survivor benefits, and a second child is not receiving anything, that second child would not be eligible for the non-parent grant because they would count both child's income. So with that, those are an overview of the benefits for informal caregivers. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now to discuss more about income benefits for formal kinship caregivers.
Thank you, Ray. Again, my name is Ryan Johnson. I'm the Associate Director with the New York State Kinship Navigator. I've been with the Navigator since about 2015. I'm going to be talking about formal care, so foster care, kin gap, and adoption, and what those benefits look like for caregivers. So as Ray mentioned, different types of care involve different amounts of support. Foster care is different than informal care because it involves a connection with Child Protective Services. So CPS or ACS in New York City must be involved with a child before they become eligible for foster care. So if there's a child who already has a family that has custody of them, so if grandma already has custody, and that's sole custody or joint custody under Article 6 of the Family Court Act, that would be considered permanency. So those families are not going to be eligible for foster care. But if they have temporary custody under Article 10, or they have another removal proceeding that would give them the ability to become an emergency certified foster parent, they'll be eligible for the benefits we're about to talk about. In New York, there are less than 4,500 children in kinship foster care, meaning that they've been removed by Child Protective Services and placed in a foster home with a kinship caregiver. There's about 18,000 children in foster care in New York State right now. So it's about 25% roughly that are in kinship foster care in New York State. Again, as I mentioned, before the child enters foster care, CPS has to have a removal via a judicial order in order to start the foster care certification process. Kinship caregivers are supposed to be approached with their legal options. OCFS has made available a lot of different guidebooks, documents, trifolds that are supposed to be intended, that are intended to be used by CPS workers as tools to give to families to help them understand their legal permanency options. We found in statewide surveys that those are not always given out. It's important for families to know what their legal options are, especially if they have the opportunity to become a foster parent, because the level of support is much greater if they end up in foster care as opposed to if they end up in informal care or private custody. If a caregiver is willing to become a foster parent, there are two ways in which a Child Protective Services unit can place that child in their home. One is to do an emergency certification of that prospective relative caregiver. That would mean that that household is able to start drawing down on foster care benefits right away. The other option is to do temporary custody under Article 10 of the Family Court Act. Sometimes it's called the 1017, or you even heard Ray refer to it as an end docket placement earlier. Temporary custody arrangements are really just a placement mechanism that CPS has at its disposal to place a child immediately in the home of a kinship caregiver while they try to find a different permanent solution. That can be either Article 6 custody or moving that child into a foster care arrangement with that caregiver. While that caregiver is in a temporary custody arrangement, they are able to go get the non-parent child-only grant that Ray just spent a bunch of time talking about. So if they are not emergency certified but potentially are on their way to a full certification, they can be getting the child-only non-parent grant in the meantime. The benefits of kinship foster care are there's a lot more support. There's case management, supervised visitation assistance. Part of the stipend includes a clothing allowance. There's a monthly stipend that we're going to talk about how that's calculated in just a little bit. Children are eligible for free school lunches. They can exit foster care to subsidized permanency, and obviously permanency is a buzzword we use in child welfare. We're trying to find long-term solutions for children in care. And so the long-term solution cannot be foster care forever. You have from foster care, kin gap, or adoption, which are two other options that we're going to be talking about here in a minute. And both of those options are subsidized the majority of the time. Foster parent classes are definitely a benefit to kinship care. Kinship caregivers are typically asked to take children on a moment's notice, and these children have experienced trauma. These children have a plethora of needs, and caregivers are often overwhelmed with the needs that are presenting in the children that they're caring for, especially based around the idea that they've had a relationship with these children, and it's usually been a positive relationship before the child came into their home, and now all of a sudden the child has trauma, has issues that they're expressing, and the caregivers are really struggling with that. And foster parent classes by many counties are seen as, oh, this is a drag. These caregivers have to go through foster parenting classes when they could just take custody. From the navigator's point of view, we believe foster parent classes really are a tool that counties ought to be using to equip caregivers to understand how to deal with kids that have experienced trauma, how to navigate the child welfare system, how to navigate the court system. And so foster parent classes really are a benefit of kinship foster care that caregivers outside of this system don't really have an opportunity to take advantage of. Certain counties have respite opportunities and community-based services for high-needs children that come with foster care as well. That can be more difficult to obtain outside of foster care. The foster care stipend is pretty much always more money than what a child can receive outside of foster care. And in a few slides, I'll be showing you a comparison chart between the non-parent child-only TANF dollars and foster care dollars and kin gap and adoption dollars and what that looks like for kids. Age of children is how a county might consider how much subsidy a caregiver can get. So you can see the age breakout here. The older the child, the more difficult to place they are and the more financial resources are given to a caregiver. And then certainly the level of physical, emotional, and mental need, the rates are based upon a child's needs. Like I mentioned, foster care placements are time limited. When a child enters foster care, the goal is always return to parent or reunification until it's ruled out by the county and by a judge. So oftentimes caregivers can be afraid that, well, the parent is negative influence on the child or has abused the child, and, why is a return to parent goal still the permanency goal? It always starts as the permanency goal. Almost always starts as the permanency goal for children in care. It is up to the county and to a judge to change the permanency goal, meaning how does this child exit foster care? Once those criteria have been met for not allowing a child to return to their parent because the parent has not been following through with their plan to reunify, the kinship foster parents are then given two options, either to adopt or to go into something called KinGap. So first we're going to talk about adoption. If you have a caregiver who is contemplating adoption, we always tell folks, don't wait to go into private care and then do a private adoption. Adoptions are difficult to do. So if you're a foster parent and you're considering adoption, do adoption from foster care. It does require the parent's rights to be given up, either voluntarily or by the parent or terminated by a judge. Voluntary turning over of rights is certainly a path of less resistance in court. If they have to be terminated by a judge, typically parents have the right to an appeal process as well, and that can take some time. There is a maintenance subsidy, an agreement between the social services district and the adoptive parent that may be paid to an adoptive parent depending on whether or not the child meets certain eligibility criteria. Specifically, are they considered a hard-to-place child and or are they a handicapped child? So sometimes a baby might not qualify for an adoption subsidy because, number one, they're not hard to place, and number two, they may or may not be handicapped. So you might see younger children not exit foster care with an adoption subsidy. But for the most part, you'll see these kids have some kind of trauma, some kind of emotional behavioral health disorder, especially if the children are a little bit older, and so adoption subsidies are available for those children. The maintenance payment rate is based upon the foster care board rate at a local Department of Social Services. So what that means is how much was that child getting while that child was in care? The maintenance payment rate is going to be based upon that rate, and then the rate, again, may be affected by the age of the child, the address of the adoptive parents, and the parent income and size of family. KinGap is different than adoption. So whereas adoption requires a termination of parental rights, meaning that the parents are no longer responsible for those children, KinGap stands for the Kinship Guardianship Assistance Program. It's only available to kinship foster parents. So this is a question that we get quite a bit. Can someone with a legal order of custody, Article 6 custody, get KinGap? And the answer is no. You have to be a foster parent first, and you have to be specifically a kinship foster parent. So the other question is, well, is this available to foster parents who did not know the child before that child came into their care? The answer to that is no. KinGap is only available to kinship foster parents. The child has to have been in foster care with that kinship caregiver for at least 6 months. A fact-finding hearing and a permanency hearing must have already been completed, and return to parent and adoption must be ruled out. Like I mentioned, KinGap does not require a termination of parental rights. Why that is important? Well, for some families, when you have a grandmother taking care of a child and it's her son whose child that was, it can be difficult to tell a son, you're cut off from this family until this child turns 18. Not terminating those parents' rights means that there can be some form of involvement of that parent with the family moving forward. Typically, what no termination of parental rights means is that a parent maintains their right to visitation. If a caregiver is concerned about how much contact a parent has with the child moving forward, they can get a court order of visitation to specifically indicate what that visitation looks like moving forward. Like I mentioned earlier, kin gap does not require termination, but a kin gap guardian may pursue adoption. It would be considered a private adoption after they've exited foster care into kin gap. We tell folks, if you're considering adoption at all, do it while you're in foster care. Do not go to kin gap thinking that adoption is going to be a good option later on. It's much more complicated after you've left the foster care system. So a kin gap agreement is between the caregiver and the county. It essentially is the caregiver agreeing with the county to go and pursue private guardianship from family court, and the county will give a subsidy to the caregiver for exiting foster care. The subsidy must be at least 75% of the rate that the child received while they were in foster care, and the subsidy may continue until the child turns 18 or 21. 21 if the child is continuing to be in school, and that can be college or vocational school. If the child is working at least 80 hours per month or has a disability that restricts them from working or going to school. So as long as the child is not doing nothing, the caregiver can continue to receive the subsidy on behalf of that child. So let's take a look at the subsidy comparison between foster care, kin gap, and adoption and private care, the non-parent child-only grant. So the left-hand column here is going to be what Ray talked about at the beginning of this presentation. TANF stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. That is the public assistance grant that Ray talked about. In the first box here, you'll see one child living with a relative outside foster care. The relative themselves is not receiving public assistance or subsidized rent, so they are getting the full non-parent child-only grant. You're looking at approximately $430 per month. That is one child. If you go down to the next box and you add a second child, as Ray mentioned, that second child is going to be slotted under the open public assistance case of the first child, meaning that they're going to get a lesser subsidy, about $150 or so. So you'll see for two children, both getting the full non-parent child-only grant that they're eligible for, about $616 per month for both children. You'll see for three children in the same instance, again, the second and third child are being allocated under the first child's open public assistance case. You're looking at just under $800 per month. Now let's compare to foster care. One child placed in foster care with a fully certified relative, including a clothing allowance, is getting about $650 per month. If you have two children placed in foster care with a fully certified relative, you're looking at about $1,300 per month. Why the difference? Well, the difference is that in foster care, each child is treated with their own subsidy as a separate case. So each child, ages 6 to 11 in this instance, are each getting a full foster care subsidy. One of the things that I don't think we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar was there are about 1.6 children per kinship household, meaning that more often than not, caregivers are taking 2 children or more. So having the option to become a foster parent certainly is something that they want to have access to because they'll get a larger subsidy for it. And certainly 3 children, you're looking at just shy of $2,000 per month. It's a big help when you're taking on 3 children all of a sudden to be able to have access to this amount of money. In the final column, kin gap and adoption subsidies are very similar. Kin gap was not installed in New York State until 2011, and it was installed to look essentially like an adoption subsidy. So if you're getting 100% of your subsidy, the amount is going to be the same as what you received in foster care. Same thing in the next box is that, again, if you're receiving 100% of your subsidy, you're getting the same amount that you were receiving in foster care. A county does have the ability to lower the subsidy down to 75% of what you were receiving in foster care. And what that means essentially is the county needs to be looking at what the needs of the caregiver are, what the needs of the child are, and ultimately is going to be looking at their internal county resources because the kin gap subsidy is paid out of the foster care block grant. It tends to be a negative part of the KinGAP conversation because it does require counties to pay a subsidy out of their foster care block grant. Referring to the navigator using our permission to contact form, if you have caregivers you'd like to refer to our program to learn more about these types of benefits, to have us help them with them, we're certainly happy to talk to caregivers, talk to professionals working with caregivers. Aside from just having them call our helpline number, which you can find on our website or on a lot of our materials, the way to have us call them is to use our permission to contact form. It makes it easier for kinship families to have us contact them. When we did this as a pilot project from 2012 to 2015 in 5 counties, we saw a 600% increase in the number of caregivers that we were able to contact. So it helps increase knowledge and supports from us. We give caregivers local referrals. We can do local advocacy and legal pro bono effort. We try to refer folks to legal services in their area. The permission to contact form is not a complicated document by any stretch. It literally is, we need a signature, permission to call them, and a telephone number to reach them at what time of day they'd like to be contacted. Excuse me. The signature is important because that gives us permission to contact them. But once you, the worker, have emailed us or faxed this to us, we will contact them within 48 hours. There are a few questions and comments that have been brought up specifically about KinGAP. I will answer those right now, and then I will stop talking for a second and allow other questions to come in. The one question that was asked about guardianship, if grandparents have guardianship, can the grandparents become foster parents? The answer is no. Guardianship is similar to custody in that they're both court orders that the county would consider a permanent solution for the child already. So for a child to come into foster care, Child Protective Services would need to remove a child. And they can do it if there's no court order. That means the custody technically still resides with the parent. So CPS could, if a child was living with a grandparent with no court order, go and do a removal from the parents because custody technically still resides with the parents, legal custody. The same would be true for temporary custody because they've already removed from the biological parents and given the child. So that case would still be eligible for foster care as well. But if a grandparent has custody or guardianship already, they cannot become foster parents because that portion of CPS removal would have to come against the grandparent, and obviously that's not what we're looking for. Can the grandparents be involved in KinGAP? Certainly if they're a kinship foster parent, they can exit to KinGAP as a permanency option, and the grandchildren have to have been in foster care with that kinship foster parent. So in this instance, a kinship grandparent who is the foster parent. They would have to have been in their care for 6 months, not just regular foster care with somebody else. They would have to be in care with the kinship caregiver for 6 months first. And the foster care payment amounts, do they only refer to when a relative is in fully certified foster care, or do the amounts also apply when a non-relative is the fully certified foster parent as well? If a non-relative is a fully certified foster parent, I'm assuming that question is referring to if a non-kinship foster parent is a foster parent of a child. And yes, that is true. Those numbers are same for non-kinship foster parents, meaning they do not have a previous relationship with the child. They're just a regular foster parent. And if the kinship and the non-kinship foster parents receive the same amount of money, it's not different for kinship versus non-kinship. Does the Kinship Navigator work in all counties? Yes, we work in all 62 counties across New York State. We have information on our website about all 62 counties, kinship-specific referrals. We're happy to talk to any caregiver from any county around the state, including New York City. There are a lot of resources for kinship caregivers in New York City. So please feel free to have caregivers reach out to us or to use the permission to contact form, and we're happy to reach out to them. If you want to know the difference between legal custody and legal guardianship, you should tune in to the webinar on March 3rd.
So I want to thank you, Ryan and Ray, for going through that detailed information in a way that I think was really organized and easy to understand. And I don't know about everybody else, but I'm really glad that if I had a question about this, I understand it better and I understand the complexity, but I also know that I should call you because there's so many layers and details and things people would want to think through depending on the circumstances that they're in. So it's great to both have the information and also know that we can contact you. And here's the Kinship Navigator helpline number and also emails for Ray and Ryan, although I think probably the helpline is where you want to start if you have questions related to a specific family. And I also want to just provide this link to the first webinar in this series, which was, as Ryan and Ray mentioned, kind of an overview of the kinship care system in New York State. That's available now. And on one of the earlier slides, you saw the link so that you can register for the March 3rd webinar, looking at some of the legal implications and options available to families. So I want to just check to see, do we have any additional questions that have come through? Or are we, it looks like maybe we've answered all of the questions. The great news is when we sign off of this webinar, you'll get a survey form that will ask you how well this webinar met your needs, but also has a space for you to let us know if you have any additional questions on this topic specifically or on kinship care in general, or if there are webinars that you'd like to see CTAC host in the future to further your knowledge in any way. So I want to thank everyone for participating. I really want to thank our partners, Families Together New York State, who helped us put this webinar series together, and Ray and Ryan. And I would encourage everyone to stick around when the webinar closes down so that you can provide us with some feedback. And thank you very much.